Double Bubble? More like Toil and Trouble. It's Bubble Bobble on episode 120 of Game Boy Works. As with the last episode, this week's Game Boy Works is based heavily on an NES game released in the US in 1988. As such, it really ought to be prefaced by an NES Works episode for context, but unlike Renegade, Bubble Bobble came out at the tail end of '88 rather than the very beginning, so that would require a pause of about 30 weeks before we could move ahead here. On one hand, this means I really need to rethink the relationship between NES and Game Boy Works. On the other hand, it means you'll have to just deal with it. So, Bubble Bobble. Released by Taito in arcades in 1986, this adorable game is probably best known for its remarkably faithful NES adaptation. Although the NES game didn't quite capture the full graphical detail of the coin-op, and the developers moved a few of the more adult bonus items like the martini, as well as the bonus rooms, on the whole, the NES game did a great job of reproducing the source material. Bubble Bobble for NES became a minor hit and has gone on to remain many players' all-time favorite game. The thing about people who love Bubble Bobble is that they come in pairs. The original arcade machine showed up around the same time that Atari's Gauntlet hit, and the year before Renegade sequel Double Dragon arrived. And all three attempted to tackle the issue of earning quarters from players in the same way, encourage them to play together. Bubble Bobble took a very different tack than those other games. Gauntlet and Double Dragon were all about pressuring players to team up and pump quarters into the machine, throwing enemies and hazards alike into the mix in numbers sufficient to overwhelm any solo player. In Gauntlet, time itself was the enemy, slowly sapping even a skillful player's energy and demanding they win by sheer force of wealth. These machines were going to earn their payday whether by pummeling a single player with constant game over screens or by driving them to convince others to join in. Bubble Bobble was never so ruthless. Oh, it can be a tough game in places, with its single-hit kills and intricate mechanical and stage interactions, but you don't play Bubble Bobble with another player because you have to. You play together because it's so much more fun that way. Well, there is the matter of not being able to experience the true ending if you play solo. So, I suppose multiplayer by force does factor in, but you don't realize that until you've cleared all 100 stages, so it's fine. Bubble Bobble is the ultimate friendship game, or the ultimate date game. It's two cute dinosaur friends working together to attract adorable monsters and bubbles, transforming them into candy, and the game is specifically geared toward multiplayer. The single-screen design of Bubble Bobble's stages harkens back to one-board arcade classics of the early 80s, but it's bigger, moves more quickly, and features far more happening on screen at any given time than, say, Kangaroo or Rock'n'Roll. The protagonists, Bubblin' and Bobblin', can practically fill the screen with bubbles, and a dozen monsters can swarm onto the screen all at once, all while the levels are flooded with things like power-up items and, floods. What really seals the deal for Bubble Bobble's greatness is the way its interactive elements interact. Bubbles aren't simply good for trapping enemies. Once you encase a foe, you can burst the enclosing bubble to transform the enemy into a power-up. You can also use bubbles as a platform to reach high platforms and work your way out of traps, which is a big part of where the teamwork comes into play. Setting up your friend for a cool maneuver in which they hop up to the top of the screen, or help you perform a pincer maneuver on a cluster of bad guys, creates a unique multiplayer dynamic unlike anything seen in contemporary co-op arcade games. And this has a lot to do with why Bubble Bobble has become permanently enshrined in the annals of history's most beloved video games. It's also why you've probably never heard much about the Game Boy adaptation of Bubble Bobble, because this version abandons several elements of the arcade game and comes off feeling like a very different experience as a result. At this point in the Game Boy's life, we know better than to expect perfect arcade or console ports, but you'd think that the visual simplicity and single-screen design of Bubble Bobble, not to mention the Game Boy's Link capabilities, would lend themselves to a more faithful port. But no, Bubble Bobble on Game Boy recreates the characters, monsters, and base mechanics of the arcade classic with admirable fidelity, but from there it's anyone's guess. Of course, faithful recreations of the visuals means that, once again, we have a Game Boy adaptation that maintains its source material's visual integrity at the expense of playability. Bubble Bobble was originally designed as a single-screen arcade action game, and its fixed viewpoint was specifically designed to allow players to take in the many on-screen happenings at a glance. Bubble Bobble on Game Boy zooms in and gives players a cropped viewpoint, cutting out about half a stage's pixel information at any given time. In this Bubble Bobble, that means danger is constantly lurking unseen, overhead or below, ready to kill you if you make a single false jump, and making use of bubbles as temporary platforms to quickly scramble to the top of the board far riskier. It also means that predicting where you'll end up when exploiting the loop effect that links the bottom and top of the screen together is far more difficult. But that's not the real issue here. No, the real issue is that Bubble Bobble on Game Boy is a single-player experience. Rather than teaming up with his brother Boblin, player one character Bublin instead has to travel into a cave to retrieve magical water that will heal his sick brother who's laid up in bed and out of action. So it's just you and a whole lot of monsters and bubbles and fruit icons through a whopping 200 stages. This wasn't the only Bubble Bobble adaptation to abandon the original game's emphasis on multiplayer, but it might be the most egregious. Multiplayer connectivity was such a huge part of Game Boy's appeal, and yet, here we are with what is supposed to be a multiplayer game that disregards that element altogether. The saving grace here, I suppose, is that the other portable conversion of Bubble Bobble, 1994's Game Gear port, also failed to include cooperative play, having been based on the single-player Bubble Bobble for Sega Master System. So Nintendo and Sega fans alike were SOL, equals at last in Taito's indifference. But disregarding this version altogether, it's slightly unfair to Game Boy Bubble Bobble. Yes, this conversion fumbles some very fundamental considerations and feels diminished as a result, but it's not unplayable, it's not even unenjoyable. Even as they reduced the player count of Bubble Bobble by 1/2, Taito also doubled its level count. There's probably a philosophical debate to be had over whether twice as much of a decent thing is worth as much as a normal amount of a great thing, but this isn't really the forum for that discussion. Bubble Bobble played solo becomes a more typical game experience. The changes here are a bit like the revisions Tosei made for the Tower of DRUGA on Game Boy. As with DRUGA, this Bubble Bobble has bosses every few floors, and defeating them holds the key to earning the best ending. This time, rather than needing to team up with another person to defeat the villainous Super Drunk in tandem, instead you need to acquire treasures hidden behind the doors that are revealed as you take down the big bad guys. The only real boss in the original Bubble Bobble was Super Drunk at the very end, so this changes up the pacing dynamic of the adventure. Or at the very least, it brings Bubble more into line with some of the spin-offs and sequels. Most of the franchise's core mechanics remain intact. Blowing bubbles to trap and burst monsters, check. An almost inscrutable power-up and bonus system that causes every playthrough to shake out a little differently, check. Elemental bubbles that flood the screen with water or let you fire blasts of electricity or fire, check. The indestructible Baron von Blubba showing up to light a fire under your ass if you take too long to complete a stage, check. In taking away the second player, this Bubble Bobble ratchets up the puzzle-like quality of the adventure. Many levels here require a bit more persistence to solve than in the arcade, and you'll find yourself continuing pretty frequently. Thankfully, the designers of this version did at least take the expanded scope and increased difficulty of this rendition to heart. They're quite generous with the continue system. There's also a password system that allows you to record your progress, meaning you don't have to play all 200 stages in a single sitting. Level layouts have been almost completely reworked from the arcade and NES version, presumably to accommodate for the introduction of scrolling caused by the zoomed-in viewpoint. The close cropped screen perspective isn't great, but it's somewhat understandable why Taito, who does appear to have developed this version internally surprisingly enough, decided to retain full-sized sprites rather than downscaling everything. The sheer number of objects that ends up being thrown around on the screen in Bubble Bobble really taxes the Game Boy's capabilities. All the 8-bit conversions of the game suffered from severe flicker as the program code tried to sort out sprite display priorities, and it's especially bad here. Bubble Bobble prioritizes character and enemy sprites, so they always appear solid on the screen, which is very considerate technical design. The trade-off is that bubbles shimmer and flicker, and the more bubbles that appear at once, the worse it becomes. When played on original Game Boy hardware, which was the only option available when Bubble Bobble debuted in Japan at the end of 1990, the combination of massive sprite flicker and the Game Boy's dim, smeary screen makes it really hard to track the location and movement of bubbles. There are times when most of the active characters, bubbles, and bonuses end up on screen all at once, and all you can see are quarter-circle objects flitting around almost at random. These moments would be far worse if the stages had been downscaled to cram all characters and bubbles into view at all times. So it's a bit of a strange conversion, quite different from the original, yet similar enough in most respects that the discrepancies really stand out. At least the game's infamous, endlessly looping stage theme plays throughout the quest. Always. Always. We'll see more of Bubble Bobble in NES works eventually. For now though, this ain't quite it, Chief. import title this episode is another game based on a long-running manga and anime that, despite its decades of history, most Americans have probably never heard of. Yeah, it's one of those. Chibi Maruko-chan was a slice-of-life comic written by Momoko Sakura. The original manga ran from 1986 to 1996, and it's been adapted into multiple cartoons, live-action dramas, and films. The most recent being a 2015 movie that was released shortly before the tragic passing of Sakura from breast cancer. This game's specific release timing, December 7, 1990, was neither haphazard nor accidental. Chibi Maruko-chan, Okazukai Daisakusen, arrived 1 week before the theatrical debut of the first movie based on the property, so it was clearly positioned here as a tie-in. Okazukai Daisakusen was developed by Kid, whose work we've already seen with BURAI Fighter Deluxe. Kid is best known for their action games like Kickmaster, but this is not that. On its surface, Okazukai Daisakusen looks like a role-playing game, but it is not. This is a game about a small child, and it is calibrated to work as such. It is a game about going shopping and buying stuff. Our heroine, Maruko-chan, needs to earn enough cash to buy the things she wants, about 10 bucks. Since she's a little kid, she can't take on jobs, so she wanders around town, challenging her neighbors to low-stakes gambling games. And that's Okazukai Daisakusen. You are a small child walking around a town, asking adults to play minigames with you. These are all generally guessing games, like rock, paper, scissors, but they all have one thing in common. They're all completely random. And that's the whole game. It's a string of random minigames that you need to complete in order to earn money and go buy things at a store. There's very little depth here that I can find, and some definite potential for frustration. If you run out of cash, you can go back home and take another 30 yen out of your piggy bank. However, if your mother happens to come home while you're in the house, the game ends instantly, no matter how much money you have put by. It's hard to imagine anyone who isn't an 8-year-old Japanese girl in 1990 finding much of value here. Next time on Game Boy Works, apply directly to the forehead.